Today's topic is selecting a research method, topic 1.4. Today we will be looking at the flaws that are inherent in some research designs. However, I want to remind you that in the previous lesson, you guys looked at experimental methods, and you need to remember that independent variables and dependent variables are needed for experimental methods. Independent variables are manipulated by the researcher to determine an outcome, and dependent variables measure the comparison between the two. What was the reaction of the subjects? So what are we looking at specifically today? We're looking at those flaws. Many research studies often have to be cautious that their study does not have flaws or biases. Some of the most common ones will be found in this lesson: confounding variables, placebo effect, participant bias, and experimental bias. Both participant bias and experimental biases have a alternative way that researchers can avoid them. So let's start with confounding variables. Confounding variables are factors that interfere or influence a study that was not intended or expected by the researcher. For example, a researcher is interested in the effect exercise has on the overall health of subjects, but did not take into account the subject's prior health conditions or diet. So they're looking that, if you do this many exercises a day, you will have better health. However, if the person is exercising every day and also still eating lots of junk food, lots of snacks, and the researcher is not aware of this, it's going to affect the outcome of the study. That's a confounding variable. The placebo effect is also really interesting in the fact that placebos are what researchers give their subjects in order to have that thing that they're going to measure. Some people are going to get the thing, the substance, the action, something given to them. But in some studies, subjects expect an outcome. So they react to something that they're not actually being given. So someone is trying a new medicine to alleviate headaches, and they are given a substance. They believe that this is a substance that's going to help with their headaches. And so all of a sudden, poof, headaches are gone. However, they got the placebo. So the placebo effect is the belief in some type of substance or action or something given by the researcher to make sure that they're the control group. They're making sure that they're going to be tested against the rest of the experiment. However, subjects think, I got it, I feel better, we're done. Okay? The next two kind of have students have a harder time understanding because participant and subject bias seems like, oh, well, I'm just helping out this research. However, it can really make a study go way wrong. So consciously or unconsciously behaving in ways to ensure that the research outcomes fit the subjects now expectations. So they believe that this is what is expected of them, and so they act in a certain way. So one of the most famous studies that I can think of is by Philip Zimbardo, who did the Stanford Prison Experiment at Stanford University. And there was one particular participant, his name was John Wayne. Well, actually, his chosen guard name was John Wayne, and he behaved like how he thought guards would react. And so he was really mean to the prisoners. He did some things that, which you'll find out later on when we look at the social psych unit. He did some really horrific things that was appalling. And when asked later on in the debriefing why he did it, he said, well, this is how real guards act. And I wanted to make sure that Zimbardo's study went the way he planned. That is participant biased. Okay, so how do we get around participant bias? We need to have what's called single blind procedure. And this is that the subjects are not aware if they're in the control group or the experimental group. They are not aware, and because of that, they are acting the way they would naturally act rather than acting a certain way to get this the data to come back in a certain way. Okay, so to avoid participant bias, researchers often use what is called a single blind study. Then you have experimenter research bias. Now, this is also one that can be very complicated because researchers really want their studies to work. Oftentimes, there's thousands of dollars that are getting put into their study, and so they want the outcome to fit their expectation, their hypothesis, their theory. And so, in the long run, they end up messing up the study because they're only looking for certain things. And the best example for this is, again, the Sanford prison experiment with Philip Zimbardo. He even says that he should have removed himself as a prison warden because he was too close to the study. And it took his wife, you got to hear that story, it's really, really funny. It took his future wife actually to say to him, uh, you're doing really wrong by these young men. What you're doing is not right. And it was at that moment that he realized he had to cancel his study after only 6 days. So we will talk more about the social psychology unit Zimbardo study because it is fascinating. Um, it is a cornerstone of social psychology. And so participant biased experimenter bias, how you get around that, experimenter bias, not participant, how you get around experimenter bias is that you do what's called a double-blind study. And double-blind studies, our procedure is where neither the researcher or the subject know who is in the control group or the experimental group. And oftentimes my students say to me, Miss Austin, well then how does anybody know what's going on? Usually the experimenter totally pulls himself out and his team kind of assign anonymously the control group, the experimental group to the subjects. And only the subjects know whether they are in the study or not, but they don't know whether they're in the control group or the experimental group. And then after the study is over, all that data gets combined and then they are able to combine it and see that, oh, this group of people were in the control group, this group of people were in the experimental group, and therefore they were able to um, then figure out what the results of the study. So in order to avoid participant bias, researchers use double-blind procedure, and in order to avoid participant bias, researchers use single-blind procedures. Okay, so what is the takeaway from this? The takeaway is biases are often um, happen within studies, biases and flaws, and researchers have to be very aware and conscious, but there is a way around it. They just have to take the time to figure it out. In the next video, we will examine one of the most famous studies called the Hawthorne plant study that had flaws and biases. All right, thank you for watching.